It's 2020. The Nagorno-Karabakh war had just concluded, and people on the internet are coming up with some wild conjectures. A 50-year-old argument, the death of tanks, has raised its ugly head once more. But does this conflict usher in the end of tanks, or will other weapons draw the shorter straw? In the Karabakh war, Azerbaijan destroyed hundreds of tanks, IFVs, trucks, artillery and bunkers. Much of this success was due to Turkish-made Bayraktar TB2 drones and Israeli-made Harop suicide drones. The standard tactic of the war was to destroy enemy air defenses first, then switch over to tanks and destroy them in turn. This coup of tactics and technology fired up the futurists to such a degree that some are even claiming that ground warfare conducted by manned systems will soon become irrelevant. But was the Karabakh war truly such a watershed moment, and will drones become a game changer? Looking back on history, we can conclude this will hardly be the case. The sequential destruction of air defenses, tanks, artillery, bunkers and infantry is nothing new. Attack helicopters like the Apache or the Cobra and ground attack aircraft like the A-10 have been doing exactly this since the first Gulf War. The vulnerability of ground assets devoid of cover to air assets is nothing new. And this brings us to our point. The question that arises from the Karabakh war is not one of cheap drones versus expensive tanks, but rather drones competing with other aircraft to do the same job. In combined arms operations that are almost as old as warfare itself, every type of soldier or every class of weapon system has its specific role or specific slot it has to fill. In modern warfare, armor and infantry are tasked with occupying and holding ground. Artillery is tasked with destroying targets that are at a considerable distance in a cheap and effective way. Ground attack aircraft and drones in turn are entrusted with the destruction of tanks, artillery and infantry from the air. Within this system, no class of weapon can take on the role of another class of weapon. Aircraft can never take or hold ground, and neither can they replicate the volume and efficiency of artillery. Units from different classes can only work within their designated slots. This cooperation between the arms is precisely what makes combined arms operations superior to tactics that rely only on one class of weapon or soldier. A good analogy to the present transformations would be the introduction and standardization of personal firearms on the battlefields of the 16th century. That revolution ultimately led to the pike and shot formations that dominated the battlefields for 150 years. Using these tactics, pikemen and musketeers fought in combined arms formations, where pikemen would provide the defense and musketeers would bring the offensive power. But this was also nothing new. In the 100 Years' War, the English used combined arms formations made up of knights armed with bills and poleaxes, covering longbowmen who provided the offensive power. The French tried the same using crossbowmen. When the 16th century came along, it wasn't the case of offensive units displacing defensive ones, but rather of muskets replacing bows and crossbows, and pikes replacing bills and poleaxes. One class of weapon did not replace the other class, but rather a more efficient weapon replaced a less efficient one within the same class or category. It should also be noted that the early modern equivalent of the tank, the armored cavalryman, did not disappear once muskets were standardized. Horsemen still wore armor in the opening stages of World War I. It was industrial age weapons, not the musket, that ended the heavy cavalry. Jumping back to the 21st century, we can conclude with certainty that tanks will not go out of fashion anytime soon. Their relative vulnerability to attack from the air does not justify it at this point. Tanks and ground units will have to improve their tactics, with special emphasis on camouflage and cover. Active protection systems and directed energy weapons may also be considered. With the advent of drones, however, other weapons within the class of weapons that are intended for air-to-ground support will not fare well. Drones will not eliminate tanks, but they will take the job of Apache's Mi-28s, A-10s and Su-25s. You, dear viewer, might see the most badass machine ever invented by man. But military planners see an antiquated dinosaur. Drones are much cheaper than these sophisticated weapons, and they are just as good at knocking out air defenses, tanks, artillery, bunkers and infantry. Drones are also unmanned. This means that losing a drone is far less costly both in terms of dollars and in terms of men. Being unmanned also has an often overlooked advantage. Imagine playing Call of Duty and compare this to actually landing on Omaha Beach. This is a fair analogy for commanding a drone from the safety of a rear echelon bunker versus personally flying an aircraft into harm's way. In the former case, the operator can concentrate 100% on his task, while in the latter this can hardly be expected. As muskets replace longbows and crossbows, so will drones supplant attack helicopters and ground attack jets. But this change will of course not happen at once. Crossbows were used all throughout the Italian wars, and it took the better part of the 16th century until they became a rarity on the battlefield. Similarly, an ever-decreasing number of longbows were maintained all throughout the Tudor period. Crossbows were even dominant in far-flung places like the Americas, where gunpowder was hard to come by. Similarly to bows and crossbows, attack helicopters will not be replaced overnight. Niche roles like counterinsurgency, combat medevac, and escort duties will still be better served by manned platforms. Apaches and A-10s will gradually be relegated to these roles, since risking them against the enemy will simply not be worth it. This tendency could already be seen in the Karabakh War, where both sides carefully husbanded their fleets of Rockfoots and Hinds, not willing to risk them in any meaningful way, instead relying on expendable drones. Warfare will undoubtedly change, as warfare always does. Tanks and infantry will have to be better hidden and only taken out of cover for decisive action. Self-propelled anti-air assets will need to evolve technologically. Radars and fire control systems will have to be more attuned to the drone. Bigger autocannons will be needed to complement the missiles. Attack helicopters and ground attack aircraft might gain a new lease on life by becoming cheaper and less complex. Apaches may be replaced by light helicopters converted to the anti-tank role. A-10s might be replaced by aircraft such as the Super Tucano that may in turn evolve into something akin to the A-1 Sky Raider. The beautiful and complex machines that dominated the Gulf War will soldier on. New models, however, will not be considered. As tanks and infantry defiantly quiver in their path, drones will take over in the class of ground attack aircraft.